Welcome, everyone. From myself and everyone at LSX, we're happy to be hosting this webinar today on planning for cell and gene therapy commercialization. So we're very happy to be hosting this webinar today in partnership with Inizio Biotech, who I'll be handing over to very shortly. Maybe just a couple of housekeeping rules in this virtual setting. We would like to make this webinar as interactive as possible. So at various points throughout the webinar, we will be launching a few polling questions. Do make use of the polling chat function to cast your votes. We'll be using the results, the live survey results, as discussion points within this webinar as well. Also, at the bottom of your screen, you will see the chat and Q&A function. Again, please do make use of both the chat and Q&A function. We can use any of these questions and comments as discussion points as well within the webinar. Until then, though, from me, I'm now going to hand over to Dean McAlister at Inizio Biotech for some further introductions before we begin. So on that note, Dean, I'm just going to bring up the slides and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you, Adam, and good day to everyone. Welcome. Inizio is very pleased to help to sponsor this event with our partners at LSX to help to continue to grow our industry and the knowledge base about this very important area around cell and gene therapy, particularly as it relates to commercialization. Just last week, the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine sponsored the Cell and Gene Therapy meeting on the Mesa, very successful event in Carlsbad, California, where the entirety of the event was all focused on getting innovative life-saving medicine into the hands of practitioners and patients. You'll hear more from our colleague, Rita Johnson-Greene, Chief Operating Officer for ARM, here in just a few moments. We do have a distinguished panel, not only involving Rita, but also some of my colleagues from across our different practice areas at Inizio. Their bios are all available on LinkedIn, but you're going to hear from my colleagues, Beckley, who's president of our Evoke Mind Plus Matter agency. Also, Greg Christianson from our Engage division. He's a principal within Nuvera. And Matt Booth from Inizio Medical, who's SVP Global Therapy Lead within ApotheCom, with a great focus and history in this particular category. The fourth quarter that we're now in will have a number of different inflection points for some key customers within this segment that certainly are pioneering the way. Vertex, BioMarin, Sarepta, Bluebird all have significant catalysts that are anticipated this quarter, all things to watch, evidencing how relevant this area of medicine really is. One area that I wanted to end on, because we're getting ready to go right into our key content, is I look back to an event in American history back at Gettysburg when Edward Everett, who was one of the great American orators of the antebellum and Civil War period, he was often remembered as the featured orator at the dedication ceremony of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. And he spoke for 2 hours before Abraham Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes with some of the most important words that we all recall, and no one remembers what Edward Everett said. I'm not going to be the Edward Everett in this story, and we're going to get right into this content. I encourage you to take advantage of the chat feature, get your questions in. We'll have time for some audience polling. And with that, we're going to go over to Rita, who will start off our content on this very important topic today. Over to you, Rita.
Thanks, Dean. So hello, everyone. Again, my name is Rita Johnson-Greene, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, ARM. I've been in the healthcare industry for about 25 years, and prior to ARM, I worked at Bluebird Bio and had the privilege of launching Zynteglo and Zynteglo and Skysona, 2 gene therapies last year in 2022. And prior to Bluebird, I actually worked at Spark Therapeutics and launched Luxturna in 2017, which is the first gene therapy to launch in the US. So something that I am immensely proud of. Just briefly, for those of you who are not familiar with ARM, we are a member-based nonprofit organization. ARM is truly the global voice of the sector. We are the leading international advocacy organization with over 400 members across 25 countries. Our membership is predominantly therapeutic developers, but we also include patient organizations, academic institutions, and tools and service providers. We have 5 key initiatives that I'm not going to touch upon right now, but I do encourage you to go to the website and take a look. But one of which is convening the sector, which Dean talked about, one of our largest conferences. And overall, we're working to modernize the healthcare system so that all patients have access. So not just the wealthy and not just the ones with private insurance, but all patients have access. And so again, if you'd like more information, please try to scan the QR code that's in my background. I tried it last night and I think it works. Or go to the ARM website or find me on LinkedIn. And obviously I'm happy to tell you more about it. And so with that, I want to jump into our content. We are excited to discuss the key themes of a successful launch of gene therapy with you today. And next slide, please. To start, this discussion only represents my personal views, so not those of my previous or current employers. Next slide, please. So we decided to hone in on 4 key topics today: pre-launch learnings, our product adoption. So whether the adoption is fast or slow, I'm going to argue that, for gene therapies, oftentimes it's not as fast as we would like. Our treatment center support, as well as the patient being at the center of it all. And truly, that is why I am blessed every day to be in this field, because of the patient and the impact that gene therapies have on patients. Next slide. So from a pre-launch perspective, we really talk about the importance of team collaboration, right? Everyone's heard that phrase, building the plane before you fly it. And we really need to get comfortable with, kind of ambiguity, right? So we have a polling question to start. And that question is, what teams are impacted by a change in the launch target population, / demographic? And so there are a number of choices there. So I'll continue to talk until we, kind of see some of those results as you decide what your answer is. But overall, when we consider the complexity of, a gene therapy, right, from a manufacturing perspective, you have the treatment center processes, you have your QTC onboarding, you have your training process, right? All of these things have something in common. And for most companies, it's their first time, right? There are 8 gene therapies in the market right now for rare diseases. And, hopefully 10 by the end of the year. But these are small numbers. And so for most companies, it truly is their first time to launch. And so you need to be flexible and seamlessly integrated in order to react to the new challenges that are going to arise during commercialization. And so, being seamlessly integrated really means that, all those cross-functional disciplines are working together. And that includes, manufacturing, patient supply, QTC engagement, your market access team, your sales team, et cetera. So I do want to pause for a second and see if we have some of the polling responses. Awesome. Okay, so everybody got it. It's all all of the above, right? And so again, just from a commercial governance perspective, when you think about the fact that it's all of the above that are impacted, right? Who's the key decision maker? When everybody's involved, right? And that's why a strong governance structure is really required. And so before we jump down to data, I do want to pause and see, Matt, can you talk about the juxtaposition between clinical findings and the payer value proposition?
Yeah, the clinical and payer value propositions, they're often developed separately, and that can often lead to inefficiencies and misalignment. So there's obviously a need for an integrated evidence plan, and that's not a new concept, obviously. It's not new to cell and gene therapy, but in cell and gene therapy, the collaboration between functions, it has to start earlier, and it has to start with the end in mind, because it's still a likelihood that clinical data for cell and gene therapies is going to be somewhat immature at the launch stage, particularly in rare diseases. But it's not just internal functions that need to collaborate early. Academic researchers, governments, providers, they all need to be collaborating with the manufacturers here. And there's also a need for RCTs to be more payer and prescriber relevant. Early access programs can potentially be leveraged as a source of local real-world evidence to inform pricing and reimbursement plans at launch, which is an area where earlier gene therapies have fallen down on, really. And also the real-world evidence plan needs to be initiated earlier as well. evidence generation around lived experience, disease burden, standard of care burden, health economics from the impact of the disease. Things like this need to be developed a lot earlier than usual, because they're needed to fill the evidential gaps and build that value story.
No, couldn't agree more. I want to pause and see if any of the other panelists have comments that they want to add.
Rita, I'll jump in real quick. Jess, I think you made a great point about, the 8 products on market, the newness of these commercial teams. In my experience, one of our former clients talked about anybody who's working in cell and gene therapy has never worked in cell and gene therapy before. It's a different idea from a commercial organization standpoint. And from our viewpoint, when we've come into these organizations to support them in the lift, we see so many more players at the table. And that's the great thing about it. And if you think about your commercial organization, and you don't just think about, okay, I'm in the market access swim lane, or I'm in the marketing swim lane, or the sales swim lane, but you bring all of those swim lanes and into the same pool and have the conversations early on. And I know we're going to talk about this later about lexicon. Everyone gets on the same page, talking the same way, and your partners, in that case, if it was Inizio or somebody else, we're all speaking the same language as well. And I think that's really important. Everyone is looking. This is a hot topic. Everybody's looking at these cell and gene therapies, and you need to get that language right in the beginning, and having all those constituents at the table at the same time is a good thing, which is an experience we see differently if we're going in a big pharma approach.
Right. No, fantastic comment, Ben, and perfect segue into the next topic, which is data. And so, one of the things that I've learned the hard way is to really be flexible with your CRM fields, right? Especially in rare disease. And I wanted to share 2 examples that I have, and then I'll turn it again back over to, my other panelists. In my early commercial operations days, we created a beautiful report, right, to model the patient journey and to model each of the steps. And of course, this report was based upon the neatly designed phases that we had, figured out during pre-launch. And after we launched, we found that patients were getting stuck in some of these steps that we knew existed, but we had assumed would operate flawlessly. And, obviously that's our mistake. Some of the treatment centers, they weren't seeing patients, from an intake perspective for 2 to 3 months. And of course, in our model, we assumed it'd be maybe 2 to 3 weeks, and so we were able to quickly, incorporate some of these, initial steps or these additional steps within our portal and within our reporting. Again, kind of speaking to that flexibility, but it was a learning for us, that just what we thought would happen isn't necessarily what happened. Another example is, the patient portal and the nomenclature associated with our patient portal versus our market access repository. Our market access team needed very granular patient information in order to begin the contracting process, right? And to contract with the right entity. And so if you think about, primary payer versus secondary payer versus even a tertiary payer, right? Well, we didn't code all of those things into the patient intake portal that the patient services team was utilizing. And so, patient services obviously were able to ask these questions, but they weren't in there initially. And so again, maybe just a few weeks later, obviously we were able to get them into the patient portal. But it just speaks to having that nomenclature, having it agreed upon upfront would have, kept us from, having some of these inefficiencies, on the back end. And so I think really spending time to ensure that you have a flexible process so that when you need to pivot, you can. That's time better spent than ensuring like the one process that you're wed to is right, because you can guarantee it's not. So I want to ask Greg, can you touch upon some of the importance of mapping the technology ecosystem?
Absolutely. So in addition to the CRM, and it ties a little bit into the cross-functional team nature and the comments that were made earlier, when you think about many people, especially the commercial folks, when they think cross-functional, they think sales, marketing, market access, but the cross-functional nature that needs to be considered here is supply chain colleagues, right? Potential medical as it comes to understanding what your certification process might be for certain treatment centers if needed. And then when you consider the number of systems across all of those different teams where data needs to be exchanged in some way, shape, or form, how do you step back and really map out your overall data and system infrastructure or ecosystem so that everybody can see how their system potentially plays with others. And so a great example between CRM and potential order management is there some or any communication happening between those two systems, right? So certain field-based individuals are aware of the activity that might be going on in the background that sits outside of kind of their immediate remit.
Yeah, no, great comments. Thank you. So next slide, please. So now we're going to move on to product marketing and adoption, right? And so one of the key questions is to brand or not to brand, right? When launching, we're often asked for, and when I say we, manufacturing companies are often asked for, unbranded patient education materials, right? And when you're small and you may not have many resources to commit, it's difficult to, to deliver both branded as well as unbranded, campaign products. And so I'd say, partnering with a patient organization to help produce, or take some of the burden off when you're trying to produce those unbranded, kind of disease state awareness and even gene therapy process, when you're trying to produce those educational materials is a good way to go. And just as a side note, patient organizations, I said partnering with one, but they should already be in your Rolodex, right? You should be consulting with them every step of the way. So it shouldn't be, a situation where you get to launch and now you're calling a patient organization. It's way too late. So that's just an aside. But from my perspective, if you have to choose, unbranded versus branded from a launch perspective, I would say unbranded, if you have no competition within the next 2 to 3 years. Right? You have your PI, you have your patient brochure, you have some other branded information that you can leverage, but really ensuring that the HCP can have a productive conversation about what is gene therapy, what is this disease and how can gene therapy help? That's important. And so if the unbranded materials help to facilitate that, you want that. However, if you are in a competitive situation in which you believe you'll have a competitor within the next 1 or 2 years, then I would say branded information. You want people to start to recognize the colors and your specific process, because every gene therapy process is slightly different, right? Or vastly different. And so you really want that brand recognition to occur as soon as possible. And so I'd say, then you need to choose branded. So I'm going to pause there and I'll turn it over to Ben to maybe talk about clarifying the messaging.
Rita, I couldn't agree more with your comment. And as you said in your upfront slide, these are your points of view. I'll say the same thing. These are my points of view as well. But we are aligned on this idea, I think, of unbranded with no competition, branded when you obviously have competition. But I think another thing to think about, and this first bullet kind of speaks to this, we see a lot of companies in that early stage. You have the founder, the inventors, the scientists. They want to talk about the platform or the vector or the foundation of where their cell and gene therapy is being delivered. And that works for a very specific audience. So what I would say is when you're thinking about the communication, make sure you're thinking about, you do have several different audiences you need to play to, not just patients and HCPs and your early adopter HCPs and KOLs, but you have your investor community, you have the market access community. You can't do one size fits all messaging for all of those target audiences. And I think that platform, this is our vehicle to deliver the gene therapy. That's a good message for those early adopters and even the investor community to have faith that you have a substantial product that's going to work inside the body. Whereas that completely loses your patient audience. They don't understand that. And I think we get into that next bullet here where you're probably going to talk about clarity and the lexicon.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I couldn't agree more. And I just want to pause and see, are there any other comments from the panelists?
Yeah, I mean, from my side, Rita, it's about the marketing materials aligning with the earlier clinical data, particularly in the publications, because that's where the credibility comes from in the messaging and the language from the marketing materials. But often, you do see that there is a lack of alignment there. And again, it comes back to the earlier collaboration. People, manufacturers and key teams within manufacturers need to agree on the way that the product is going to be described, the benefits of the product, the target patient population, and the disease itself. Even as basic as is the product a gene therapy?
Yeah.
I've seen, an example I looked at this morning, Ferring's adstiladrin. Okay, it's an modified adenovirus for bladder cancer. It expresses interferon alpha 2b, I think, and it's described as a gene therapy. Very similar platform to Amgen's Imlygic, which was approved in 2015, which is a modified herpes virus that expresses GM-CSF. The language around that platform is oncolytic viral therapy, not gene therapy. Now, that might be because in 2015, gene therapy was a more risky term to use. And now, with all of the recently approved therapies, there's more faith in gene therapies and more trust in gene therapies. But, it's that alignment around how we describe the patients, the product, the benefits in the clinical setting versus the sort of post-approval launch setting.
No, great point. And I think that's really speaks to that clarity being essential, depending upon your audience, and even some of the things that Ben just talked about. Who your audience is matters so much when it comes to your messaging. And so I'm not going to beat a dead horse there. I think that you guys really, really nailed that point. And so I'll move on to the next point, which is about if you build it. Actually, we'll stay on that slide for a minute. If you build it, they will come, right? I love talking about this because so often we think that we have this amazing product. Of course, the patients will take it, right? And that's not always the case. And so really thinking about like after the influx, right? Prior to launch, you have this pent up demand. And these are the early adopters, right? And they've been following you since BLA, through your AdCom, right? Through to approval. The thing is, you quickly bleed through those patients. And then after that, the journey to yes can be pretty long. I've experienced patients waiting 2 years to decide to seek therapy, right? And the patient services team has been with them every step of the way through those 2 years until they were ready. And so don't be surprised, if you inadvertently kind of incorporate that bolus of patients, right, into your steady state demand forecast, you may be disappointed. So you just want to be very careful about that. So again, I'll pause. Are there any comments before we do move to the next slide? Okay, awesome. So next slide, please. And so now we're going to focus on the treatment center support. Right. And I know everyone's heard this phrase before. If you know one treatment center, you know one treatment center. Right. And it's true. They are individuals. Each hospital has its own individuality, and they really are different. But obviously, there are some key themes. Right. And depending upon the size, and the budget of a hospital, it really does dictate the scope of the roles that they have. I've experienced treatment centers who, really appreciated the patient services team and helping them to reinforce scheduled dates, right, for testing and for treatment, et cetera, because they didn't really have, that many people to kind of manage the patients in that way. And then I've also had treatment centers say, no, we have a full team to support these patients. Stay out of it, patient services, and it's our job to hear and listen and make sure that we, are doing what the treatment center needs us to do in order to support the patient journey. And so to that end, really not being married to, your onboarding process, to the extent that, you're so wed to it that you end up missing an opportunity because you're not listening. Right. The treatment centers, they really do know the patients, and they know them, more intricately than we as manufacturers do, and another point is that you don't want to frustrate your treatment center so much that they're waiting for your competition, right? Because at some point you will have competition, and frankly, treatment center expertise is still, it's a limited resource, and I know that there are efforts to kind of train the trainer and ensure that we're proliferating the ability to be a treatment center. But right now, that it's tailored to the expertise of particular regions. And while it's a limited resource, you want to make sure that you're preserving it and that you are looking at the treatment center as a partner. So truly asking and not telling, I think, is really important. So let's go to our polling question. Treatment centers. Should the materials for education be branded or unbranded? And I see there's already a number of answers that have come through, and it's split branded and unbranded. And so my answer is both. If you can do it for the treatment centers, it's definitely both if possible. The treatment center will absolutely ask you for unbranded materials, especially when they're introducing gene therapy and the process to a patient, right? However, you as a company will likely, want the HCP to provide, those patient materials provide your patient with branded materials, right? This kind of connects the patient to your patient services team, right? Because, you want them to connect your patient services team. And then it also introduces that brand recognition that we talked about. And in some cases, there's also, details that are specific to your process, right? For instance, how long will it take for drug delivery to occur, right? That could be weeks, that could be months, depending upon the product. You want those kind of details in your branded materials. And then we've already talked about, an impending competitor is another reason for branded. So I will say, I think it's imperative to have both available to the treatment center, as that patient is first being introduced to gene therapy or to to the disease state, and then obviously once they've decided to take your product, and it's trying to strike that balance. So I want to pause and see if anyone on the panel has anything to add here.
Yeah, Rita, I'll jump in on that. Oh, sorry, Ben.
Go, Greg.
Yeah, in regards to the both issue, right? So there's absolutely processes that patients will be going through within the treatment center that could be packaged from the treatment center's perspective in non-branded materials, just to help them understand what that particular step is and these types of things. But in order to effectively kind of articulate and communicate expectations, right, to the patient from a product perspective, having that branded so people understand, here's what I can expect, and then here's how I can prepare myself potentially to better engage or interact with the treatment center as well, right? Having the brand name associated with those materials, I think, is key.
Couldn't agree more.
Stole the words out of my mouth, Greg.
Sorry, Ben. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that was it. There's two brands on the line, right? There's the treatment center brand, and then there's actually the therapy brand. And I think everyone hit it nail on the head. You gotta have both pieces.
Awesome, thank you. So I just want to lightly touch upon the patient intake portal, right? We all, I think I've heard so many jokes now about these bespoke portals that you try to train the treatment center on, and it requires a printer, and so the joke has been, if, once there are 20 or 30 gene therapies at a treatment center, the treatment center will need a room to house all of the printers that are associated with these bespoke portals. And so I know, that's a bit of an exaggeration, because even now there are some processes that don't require a new printer. The treatment center can use their own for the patient portal, but there still are a lot of bespoke portals and that require specific training for the treatment center, and are pretty time consuming when it comes to, the treatment center implementing, your process. And so, I do think that over time, scalability is going to be extremely important, and we're kind of reaching an inflection point with regard to the number of gene therapies in the market. And this is an area where we're going to have to integrate, and there's going to, we're going to have to, find a solution that, it can be applied to a number of gene therapies. And there are different companies working on it. I'm not going to name any of them, but I do think that there's an inflection point here. And so I want to pause and see if there are any comments from the panel. Okay, awesome. And then the last one is just, being clear about your expectations from a post-marketing surveillance perspective. And this is, kind of long-term follow-up. Does the treatment center have the option to participate? Can they opt out? How does the patient opt in to, a long-term follow-up or a post-marketing survey? Are you using CIB-MTR for, to help facilitate data collection? Are you going to pay the HCP to collect this data on an ongoing basis? So I think, not waiting until like right before launch to start to think about some of these things, because they do require budget. No matter what, that collection process requires budget from the manufacturer. And so the more that you can think about them upfront, and kind of launch with your position, as opposed to trying to work it out on the back end, the better off you'll be.
Yeah, Rita, I've got the opportunity to work across 10 different gene therapies at this point over the past, 6+ years. And it's fascinating that that particular element absolutely tends to take a back seat in terms of people's strategic thought and thinking and how are they going to tactically manage that aspect. Or it tends to be, well, that's a medical follow-up problem, right? They'll deal with that. Where everybody's focusing their energy on obviously the launch and prep and the order management system and the portal that you mentioned. But that particular aspect, I feel like people tend to shortchange for sure.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because I have heard, oh, that's a medical problem. But if you think about the front line, it's typically, the treatment center liaison that's communicating that information. And so there's training associated with ensuring that they get that information, correct and accurately communicated to the treatment center. And so even if you do feel as though it's a medical activity, at some point there still needs to be, this integration between the two teams in order to make sure that it's communicated appropriately. And so that goes back to the first slide about, just that the integration across all of the teams. So no, thank you for that point, Greg. So next slide, please. And so our last, key focus is that the patient is paramount, right? And the patient education is so important, right? It's more than just educating about the disease, right, or the treatment. It's really prompting a conversation between the HCP and the patient, right? And getting them to ask questions that they may not have thought of because this is so new, right? And it's also tactfully challenging the current standard of care, right, in a way that's not offensive to the HCP, but that also gets the question of what's possible out. Someone's at my doorbell. That gets the question of what's possible, right? I can think about when we were launching Luxturna, right? Patients had often they had stopped going to the optometrist, they had stopped going to the ophthalmologist, right? And so how do you instill hope, that you may be able to see again, right, in these patients who maybe given up hope, right? And how do you get them to then ask their HCP hope-filled questions? And it's with the patient education materials, right? And then on the flip side of that, and just kind of jumping down to the 360 care for patients, right? On the flip side of that, what support are you offering patients who are not eligible, right? So Luxturna required a genetic test in order to ensure that the patient's blindness was caused by the mutation that we treated, right? Well, after that genetic test, there were patients who now found out that they weren't eligible, right? So now we've helped them instill this hope. And now, I'm not going to say not ever, because obviously there are other gene therapies being developed, but at this point in time, they are not eligible for this product, right? And so in those moments, we connected those patients with resources to address that disappointment, So I mean, there's just so much that we can talk about from a patient education perspective, but I want to pause and I want to ask, I want to turn it over to Mark and then Greg to share their experiences.
Yeah, so
I'm sorry, Matt, Matt and Greg to share their experiences. Sorry.
Yeah, so I'm coming at it from a comms perspective, Rita, and I think manufacturers need to spend time building trusted and valued relationships with patients, with patient advocacy groups, with treatment centers, and with leading experts, not just the experts that have been supporting their clinical trials. And that can come through various means. Many companies that specialize in rare diseases, they have website content that focuses on, patient well-being, how the disease impacts children and their families, and some go even as far as providing guidance on making insurance claims and accessing drug programs. And it's a two-way thing as well. It's not just an educational a relationship. I mean, you've got organizations like UPATI, which are educating patients in ways at which they can collaborate with developers of products like this in rare diseases, where those patients have few options and they want to be involved in the development process prior to their development, prior to the launch. So I think building those relationships as early as possible is absolutely paramount. Education is a part, but collaboration is perhaps a bigger part.
Great point.
I think when you think about the relationship that you'd like to have with the patient, I think this is a huge topic to philosophically land on very early on, right? As an organization, to determine what type of relationship would we like to have with the patient, because I've seen a very wide range occur where I've seen some manufacturers take the stance of, we don't want to risk getting in the way of the treatment center patient relationship and these types of things. And they very much take a reactive stance, right? So we are here with certain pieces to help you versus others that are very engaged in trying to kind of connect with the patients early on, set those expectations we talked about earlier, et cetera. So that's a key philosophical decision to make early on, because then it will then drive a lot of the other planning, right, that you'll be going through. I think the other aspect of that is determining, once you take that philosophical stance, who within the organization will maintain ownership or have ownership, depending upon where the patient is at in their journey. Rita, you mentioned patient services several times, right? I've seen patient service organizations only take ownership, let's say, of the relationship at time of prescription, right, or order, right, where I've seen others that stretch it much earlier and say, look, we will help you navigate to find a certified treatment center, right, and help educate you from an expectations perspective. So those are all really good conversations to have early on, to land on, in principle, we will be looking to do this, and then basically align roughly in the organization who might own what, because then that can really help facilitate further planning.
No, it's a fantastic point. Fantastic point. And you made me think of something else that I think is worth sharing. You know, the very first launch that I was a part of, we had an internal patient services team, and they supported throughout the entire journey. And so I kind of developed the belief that that was the only model that worked. And I had, another opportunity to actually utilize an external patient services support team, and really integrate them into the process and still support from end to end, or, kind of early on in the journey. And, there are obviously challenges with both, but I do believe that both can work. And so, sometimes smaller, gene therapy companies may, you may not have the ability to onboard, a full patient services team. And I would say, don't count out an external team until you've taken a look, because this is their expertise, right? And I think that taking that collaborative and integrated approach that we've talked about, you can find one that will work for you. So if there aren't any other comments about this, I'm going to ask Ben if you can take us home by discussing life after treatment.
Absolutely. And I think, what's interesting, Greg talked about the philosophical approach to these commercial organizations. And then Rita, you just said the words end to end. And I think those two marry very nicely. The end to end, when is the end? For a commercial organization, it's we've got the product, we've cured the patient. But for the patient, that's not necessarily the end. We have to remind ourselves that these patients, a lot of them are rare disease patients. They've grown up with this years. They went through that whole diagnostic journey for years, and HCP after HCP, and they know a lot more about their disease than many of the HCPs they're going to encounter in life. So that dialogue between the HCP and the patient should feel a little bit more natural. They're obviously more educated, and they're interested in obviously trying to get to a cure. But in research that we've done with patients, we now start to see these questions on their minds. Well, what happens to me as a patient when I have been cured? Am I not a patient anymore? I have identified for so long as a patient with XYZ rare disease, and now do I still identify that way, or do I not identify that way? Can I still be a part of the patient community? And I think this is something that is going to come up more as we start to see these cell and gene therapies come into the marketplace, and we do see more and more patients getting cured. What are we doing for those patients? How are we keeping them inclusive into the community that they've been a part of almost their whole lives? And there is maybe a responsibility, or at least a nugget of a thought, for commercial organizations to think about that end to end. Where does that end, and where are you going to continue to support those patients that have been living with this disease their whole life and now they are cured? So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Dean. Bring us home.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Ben. Thanks to all the panelists. Certainly, Rita, thank you for bringing your expertise into this. There was a question that's come in so far that I'd like to get the opinion of the group here, or whoever would like to address it. The question came in your opinion, what role does medical affairs, and specifically MSLs, play in supporting cross-functional educational initiatives for cell and gene therapy products? So anyone have an opinion on that?
I think the MSLs are a key provider of insights of the end user, the stakeholders, and I think that two-way process, that feedback loop is absolutely essential.
I think what I'll add is, one, when you think about right after launch, if you have a sales team and that sales team is, possibly going out and talking to referring physicians about, about getting those patients into the treatment center, they usually have to stick with the PI, right? So exactly what the clinical trial states, what's been agreed, FDA approved, et cetera, right? So PI. However, there are usually other studies that have been done and other, even, clinical trial results that have maybe come out after the BLA submission, things like that, that your sales team cannot talk about, but that the clinicians will know about and have questions about. And so I found that that's really one key area from an educational perspective where the MSL can really play a role. The other is in educating the treatment centers, right? Like, that you think about it, these processes are really new. And the MSLs, have had this partnership throughout the entire clinical trial process, and understand, the data and collecting cells and all those things. And so sometimes there's all these nuances, at the treatment center, like nuanced questions that, that the MSL can weigh in on, especially, if the treating physician, has a question about something. I find that the MSLs can play a strong role there as well.
Those MSLs can also bring back some insight into the organization for some feedback on how the efforts are going. They're the eyes and ears in the field that often play a very important role. And then the next step in the strategy evolution process for those organizations as they get the feedback. Greg, you had a comment.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in addition to kind of the ongoing engagement MSLs would have with whether they're referring physicians or the treatment centers themselves, a very large portion, right, of many different, especially, CAR T-like therapies, et cetera, where you've got apheresis, there's supply chain issues, and et cetera, you've got certification processes that are being put in place for treatment centers, right? So this is where they're educating the treatment centers on the processes that Rita was mentioning. There's potentially contracting involved in these types of things. Figuring out that is a key portion of the overall treatment experience in a way for these therapies for the treatment centers. And so you can think of those as critical first impressions, right, of what it's going to be like to work with your company. The MSLs play a critical role in that mix, right? So if you think about the SWAT-like team that's going to be interacting with the treatment center early on to help stand them up as a certified center, the MSLs are key, right, in that process. So I think that's another aspect to think of, it's almost like a prior to commercialization, then ongoing kind of expansion of treatment center network.
Thank you for that. We certainly welcome additional questions. If you want to type those in the Q&A or chat feature, we'll take those. And while we wait for some of those coming up, Rita, I'll give you a chance, maybe talk a little bit about what happened last week. Certainly it was a global event and I was privileged to be there and I saw a lot of things unfold. What were some of the big themes that you saw come out across the companies and ARMS membership last week at the meeting on the Mesa?
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity, Dean. It truly is as you said, it's a global event. And, when you think about the kind of some of the key issues that, or key topics that, are within the regenerative medicine space, there was a panel about financing, right? And what does a good deal versus a maybe not so well-structured deal look like when you think about some of these smaller companies that are, looking to be bought or to or to even partner in some ways. And so I thought that was a really good panel. We had Nicole Verdun do both a fireside chat as well as a panel, and she's the new leader of the OTP Super Office. And so from a regulatory perspective, there were tons of questions and comments about the regulatory process and platform technologies and accelerated approvals, right? And just talking through that. These are things that are really important to the regenerative medicine sector. We also talked about scientific affairs, and we had these science slams, which organizations were able to introduce some of the hottest and newest technologies that are coming out. Tissue therapy, so not all even gene therapy, which I thought was pretty exciting. And so I just overall, I mean, I think that it was a fantastic panel. Our CEO, Tim Hunt, got up and talked about, some of the key trends that he's seeing within the cell and gene sector holistically, which is always extremely important. And one plug for our data, you can go to our website and see it, but we do produce really strong regenerative medicine or cell and gene therapy sector data about the number of, therapeutic developers, the number of clinical trials that are taking place within the cell and gene sector. And so you can, that this data is really powerful and it's utilized a lot by our members. So these are, just some of the key highlights from a regulatory, scientific affairs, financial, and then as well as just industry data holistically. Thanks for the opportunity, Dean.
Yeah, thank you for that. A follow-up on the MSL and field medical question on what's the best way to communicate insights in this setting, and how is the feedback loop to be best closed to ensure that the MSL feels heard, their customer likely feels heard, and then what's put into practice? Does anyone have a comment on that?
So I do. I think one way that I've experienced, the MSL delivering that feedback has been, through commercial team meetings that occur at least, I would say, once a week right after launch. And then maybe, thereafter you can expand it to, every other week or every month or so. But initially every week, in which you don't discuss patient data, right? Because you have your sales team there as well. But the MSL is able to deliver some of the key themes, to the point that was made earlier that they're hearing, right? And typically this commercial team meeting includes marketing, so that, if there's impact, if there's suggestions about, the marketing materials and maybe ways that they can be tweaked, or maybe, clarity of messaging that can be improved. That's all, it's not just going to the sales team, it's also going to the marketing team, so that there's this, surround sound impact that, will then inform marketing materials that are developed later, or modifications that'll be made. So I think that, just having, a process in which you are meeting regularly and talking about and digesting those early findings are really important.
Thank you for that. Matt, we'll go to you for a question. Looking at the lexicon terminology in cell and gene therapy and how it's evolving, how products that have been in this space have begun to evolve it. Where do you think 10 years from now we might be in terms of explaining that? And if you have that knowledge, we all may want to make some investments based on your comments, but anything about the evolving lexicon?
Yeah, if I had a crystal ball to look 10 years in time, I would be applying it to more than nomenclature in gene therapy. But I don't know the answer. What I have seen is that the term gene therapy has already evolved. Okay, people are preferring to use the term genetic technologies because the traditional definition of gene therapy in terms of a one and done correction of a monogenetic disorder is a rather limited definition. And as I mentioned earlier with Adstiladrin, it's being used in a slightly different way more recently. But also I've had conversations with companies with RNA therapies. Is that a gene therapy? Is it not? I mean, if you look to the traditional definition of gene therapy, it's not, but it is a kind of genetic technology. You are putting genetic material into patients that affect protein expression. So I think it's already evolving. Which direction it takes, I guess, will be steered by where the technology goes in terms of how that develops. We're already seeing, of course, the combination of gene therapy, ex vivo gene therapy in stem cell therapies. So, it's not even a separation of, is it a cell therapy, is it a gene therapy, because they're already coming together. So I don't know the answer, but I'm just as eager to see how that develops.
Well, if I could also chime in there quickly, Dean, I think, the example that was asked in the question about Imlogic and just some of the lexicon that's being used, when you look at the lexicon that brand is using in cancer, they're calling it a viral therapy, right? They're not calling it a gene therapy. And that idea, early stages where, we talked about gene therapy and I mentioned, let's talk about our vector and our platform, and it carries this virus and it is the transporter. That would be scary to a lot of patients to say, you're going to inject me with a virus. But when you change that patient's mindset to cancer, and now we're going to inject a virus into the tumor, it kind of clicks in the audience's head like, viruses kill things. It's going to kill my cancer. And it's an interesting use of lexicon. And so again, as we move to 10 years from now, and I don't have the crystal ball either, and people become more familiar with the mechanisms or that terminology or that transport device, in this case, a virus, and we use that language as a benefit, it's really cool to see where we could go with lexicon to change audiences' mindset.
Yeah, I think what is important though is whatever language companies use, that they are aligned with themselves early on, so that the clinical data language aligns with the post-launch language, and also that language is used in a way that their audience feels comfortable with and understands. I mean, in gene therapy, the therapy area experts, the stakeholders, they don't tend to be cell and gene therapy experts. A gene therapy for a cardiovascular disease, the stakeholders are, cardiovascular surgeons mostly. They're not gene therapy experts. So you have to bear that in mind when you're making decisions about what language to use to describe products of this nature.
Getting everyone on the same page, very, very important. A couple more questions. Greg, we'll field you on one or two of these, looking out to what you learn in the patient journey mapping and experiential design that often reveals some of the fracture points along the way. And one of those can be the cost of treatment. And particularly in innovative areas like brain diseases and the areas where we see the fringes of this category of medicine going. Any comments from your practice area on this topic about navigating the points about expense and what that actually does then to availability and effect strategy?
Yeah, I think, in regards to the reimbursement aspect of the medications, et cetera, there might be others that have deeper expertise on payer strategy and pricing and these types of things. But when it comes to mapping out what is the anticipated journey for patients, right? The treatment experience end to end, and then frankly, the multitude of cost points that exist, in understanding those very clearly and then making a determination as a company or a team to say, these are the points of expense that we could actually help with, right? So you see travel and support programs that are in this space at this point in time that cover the cost for potential apheresis and then revisiting for the actual infusion of medications, but gaining clarity on not just the cost of the therapy itself, but the entire spectrum of costs associated with your therapy, and then making a determination as a company of which of those can you potentially support and ameliorate to some degree, I think is a critical step in the overall planning process.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I'd like to make a few comments from a
Sure.
Payment perspective. Yes, these gene therapies are, they are expensive for sure. And ARM, as well as other organizations, are really working with regulators and policymakers in order to advance kind of value-based payment arrangements, so that it's not just a huge one-time payment for the government, because obviously that's extremely expensive. And so that there is work being done in order to partner with the government on ensuring that non-commercial payers, so government patients, are able to have access to these products. And frankly, all of the gene therapies that I've worked on, both commercial as well as government patients, have had the ability to have access to these products. And Greg, you bring up a great point. There's been a lot of work done with CMS in order to allow benefits to be delivered to patients, like lodging, like even their caregivers having lodging for these treatments, like transportation to the treatment site, in order to ensure that the patient doesn't have to bear the burden. There's also organizations to help pay for the copay, because the copay would obviously be very expensive if your drug is a few $1 million. And so there is a lot of work being done here. Obviously, there's more to be done, but there's a lot of work being done to ensure that that the burden doesn't fall on the patient. And then I think the last thing I'll say is there's also work being done, to bring the treatment centers to the patients. Since I talked a little bit about that within the slides. But the train the trainer approach, there are some treatment centers that are really taking this seriously. And so it's not just the institutions that we'll all think of, relative to a particular disease state, that will be treatment centers, as as this train the trainer approach begins to proliferate, it'll be kind of, some other institutions that are able to, deliver gene therapies and deliver cell therapies, in ways that, now they'll have proliferated, within the United States and be more readily available, and kind of bringing that treatment to the patient, which will obviously decrease the cost holistically.
Yep. Thank you for that, Rita. And I know we are coming to the end. There was a question about how you handle delays. And I think that one thing everyone could agree on here is you have to have a long view in this sector, because there's going to be delays. There's going to be a lot of hiccups along the way. And if we were to rewind the clock back to every innovation in medicine that's happened, there were delays in those points too. And anything that's been a substantive scale change requires time and requires a lot of alignment, not always agreement within the marketplace, coming to terms with that. We've talked about that long view, and we've talked about, in essence, what is a story that's evolving here in cell and gene therapy. And with any good story, there's a beginning, middle, and an end. And I think all of us would agree that we're really just at the beginning of this, and something that will be maybe 10 years hence, as we talked about that viewpoint. The future is bright, and one day the majority of treatments for the diseases of mankind will likely be remedied through this vehicle. And that's the future that we all want to hold on to, and the promise that's there, what's represented by cell and gene therapy innovation. It's 8 companies now. Someday it'll be an almost unlimited number of companies, and we'll all be looking at the benefit of that. I like to think of things in terms of a headline. We talked about future 10 years from now. Well, imagine that it's 2033, and hopefully we're all still around within that, but we can think about the headline that might be written about cell and gene therapy, and the contribution that organizations like ARM, like organizations like Inizio, the innovation that's going on within the industry in general, we're all committed to making that headline come true. But it does require the smallest executable step being done along the way. And that's where we like to believe we have a strong contribution from Inizio for the external expertise that often these organizations simply do not have the capacity, the number of people, the resources, all of those things. That's the partnership that we can take a place in to be able to commercialize and make this headline become a reality. So thank you for giving us the last hour of your time, and we all look forward to innovation, improvements, and the chance to make a real difference so that we can look back at the legacy that we will have helped to create. So Adam, we'll let you end our call.
Thank you so much, Dean. I couldn't have put it better myself to end that fantastic webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for such a really great discussion. Rita, thank you so much for presenting those slides.
Thank you for having me.
Attendees. It was really, really great. To all of our attendees, thank you so much for all of your questions, all of your engagement in the polling questions. There will be a recording made available after this webinar. But until then, as Dean mentioned, let's see what we can do to make that headline a reality.